And thank you for continuing with BSB 41507, Certificate 4 in Project Management. I'm Trudy Robinson. This is the first of 3 presentations relating to cost management techniques. In this presentation we are covering the estimate of costs, which relates to the estimation of all costs required to complete all project activities. PMBOK 4 references Chapter 17 starting on page 165. When we talk about estimating costs, we're referring to a forecast of full project costs from concept to finalisation, but we must acknowledge that this estimate in costs will change. The cost estimate needs to ensure it addresses all costs. The costs may relate to individuals, to organisations, to the supply of materials, the provision of people, transportation, consultants. Everything must be included within the estimating of costs. The initial cost estimate is usually undertaken during the concept stage. However, it is likely that a renewal of the cost estimate will be undertaken several times throughout the course of the life cycle of the project. One of the things that you will need to be aware of is to find what variance is acceptable by the stakeholders, particularly the sponsor. The variance being what above and below the final estimate of budget will be acceptable. You will also need to ensure that you identify whether the cost estimate is for direct costs only, being the actual costs that occur directly for the project, or whether any indirect costs should be included. Indirect costs are often costs that are shared with other organisations, other projects, etc. You'll also need to determine whether, when you are actually reporting on costs, particularly when you're providing written reports, you'll need to identify whether you are reporting on the costs that are actually owed for the work that's been done, or whether it's the costs that have actually come out of the project budget. Remembering that once a project cost is approved, it may not be paid for several weeks. Another consideration will be required, particularly when projects are geographically diverse or going into other countries, and that is which currency will be used for the original budgeting, the ongoing management and the reporting. If multiple currencies are involved, it creates a great deal more complexity and a great deal more difficulty in the actual reporting. It's also important to understand your organisation's general policies. For example, you might have a social responsibility policy which advocates the use of local labour for a particular project if you're doing remote projects. You may have an occupation health and safety policy which advocates certain equipment is used. You may have a HR leave policy which states that parental leave is available, not just maternal leave but paternal leave as well. All of these policies may affect the actual budget. They might be affecting it indirectly, but they will actually affect the outcome and the costs associated with it. One of the biggest difficulties if you haven't managed a project of the particular topic before is to get to understand what is actually required for every task. For every person, what they do, how they work, how they get there, what requirements they have, any extra costs, how the work is undertaken, what materials, resources will be required, any support equipment, every stage of use of every work material, resource, etc., from its first point of identification and order all the way through to its waste or disposal. Every stage must be included because every stage is likely to have a cost. If it's acceptable, plan for the unexpected and try and put in some buffer for the costs that you are not aware of that may come into play. This may need to be removed as budgets become tighter. However, it's better to try and identify this at the beginning. So the methods of obtaining cost input to actually start to understand what costs are going to be managed throughout this project. The first, of course, is the work breakdown structure or the Gantt chart. This is significant because it's already identified the work that needs to be done and the resources that will be used. Quite often, understandably, many project managers choose to use project management software, as the software usually has a cost per resource and then will calculate the total resource costs against the timeline. Obviously the materials lists, the resource lists, the risk management plan, the scope, all of the project documentation that's previously been raised will be inputs to the cost breakdown. Another resource that we've referred to many times in the past is archive to historical projects, to be able to call upon the documentation or the individuals that worked on those projects if they had a similar nature. Obviously, obtaining quotes from specific service providers will give you a good indication of predicted costs. However, if you have quotes within your project, ensure they have a valid period so that the quote will not go out of date and therefore be invalid once you actually get to the point of starting or commencing the project. You want the quote to be valid during the cycle of being able to identify all the costs, get it up and running, get the budget approved, and then start the project. Accountants both within your organisation, within your project and outside are a great source of information, as are HR managers, area managers such as production, logistics, etc. They will often have a broad understanding of what the costs are associated with their types of service, especially if they're familiar with the type of project that you are going to be running. In PMBOK 4 on page 170, it mentions that you should consider things like health, safety, security, performance, environment, insurance, IP rights, licenses and permits. Obviously, if your project is a construction project, licenses, permits, insurance and safety, etc. are high considerations. The costs associated with these should be detailed within your cost breakdown, as should tasks within your work breakdown structure identify the need for these to be managed. Another input to the cost breakdown are contracts and other procurement inputs. Subject matter experts who would have knowledge in the areas that are being estimated. As I mentioned, top-down estimating often means that you're starting at a higher point. So in the same scenario, we may have the level of experience from previous projects where there were 50 people involved in a IT project that was being rolled out, and this has already occurred, and then the same sort of project is going to be rolled out for 100 people elsewhere. So therefore you'll be able to aggregate costs or estimates based on the previous project and then roll them down.